What is hot work? And how to take safety precautions? Hot work is any activity or process that generates a source of ignition, such as a flame, heat, or spark. This can include welding, cutting, grinding, soldering, brushing, torch-applied roofing, and pipe thawing. Hot work can be a significant fire hazard, especially when it is performed in areas where there are flammable or combustible materials. Here are some examples of hot work. Welding. Cutting with an oxyacetylene torch. Grinding metal. Soldering. Brushing. Torch-applied roofing. Pipe thawing. Using a blowtorch. Using an open flame. Hot work is often performed in construction, maintenance, and manufacturing industries. However, it can also be done in other workplaces, such as warehouse, retail stores, and office buildings. Safety precautions for hot work. To reduce the risk of fire, it is important to take safety precautions when performing hot work. These precautions include ensuring that the work area is free of flammable or combustible materials, using proper ventilation to remove heat and smoke, using fire extinguishers and other fire suppression equipment, having a designated person on standby to watch for and extinguish any fires that may occur, obtaining a hot work permit from a qualified person before performing hot work. Hot work permits are often required by law or by company policy. These permits help to ensure that the work area is safe and that all necessary precautions have been taken. By following these safety precautions, workers can help to prevent fires and other accidents from occurring during hot work operations. The Factories Act, 1948 is an act of the Parliament of India that regulates the safety, health, and working conditions of workers in factories. The Act applies to all factories employing 10 or more workers. Section 37 of the Factories Act deals with hot work. This section states that no hot work shall be carried out in any factory unless a hot work permit has been obtained from a competent person. A hot work permit is a document that authorizes the performance of hot work in a specific area at a specific time. The hot work permit must include the following information: the name of the factory, the date and time of the hot work, the specific area where the hot work will be performed, the type of hot work that will be performed, the name of the person who will be performing the hot work, the name of the person who has issued the permit. The hot work permit must be reviewed and renewed by a competent person at least every 12 hours. Other sections of the Factories Act that are relevant to hot work include Section 13, Ventilation and Temperature. Section 22, Work on or near machinery in motion. Section 36, Precautions against dangerous fumes, gases, etc. Section 38, Precautions in case of fire. Safety precautions for hot work in factories. In addition to obtaining a hot work permit, there are a number of other safety precautions that must be taken when performing hot work in factories. These precautions include ensuring that the work area is free of flammable or combustible materials, using proper ventilation to remove heat and smoke, using fire extinguishers and other fire suppression equipment, having a designated person on standby to watch for and extinguish any fires that may occur, training workers on how to safely perform hot work operations. By following these safety precautions, factories can help to prevent fires and other accidents from occurring during hot work operations. What rectification should be taken before starting a hot work? To ensure the safety of hot work, it is important to take the following rectifications before starting. Eliminate or control all sources of ignition. This includes flammable liquids, gases, and dusts. If possible, hot work should be performed in a confined space that has been purged with inert gas. Inspect the work area for potential fire hazards. This includes checking for frayed wires, overloaded electrical circuits, and damaged equipment. Any hazards should be corrected before hot work begins. Post warning signs and barricades around the work area. This will help to keep unauthorized personnel away from the hot work area. Evacuate all non-essential personnel from the work area. Have a fire extinguisher and other firefighting equipment on hand. Have a qualified person on standby to monitor the hot work area and extinguish any fires that may occur. In addition to the above, the following rectifications may also be necessary depending on the specific circumstances of the hot work. Remove flammable materials from the work area. Cover or shield combustible surfaces. Ventilate the work area to remove fumes and gases. Install temporary fire protection measures, such as fire blankets or sprinklers. It is important to note that the specific rectifications required will vary depending on the type of hot work being performed and the specific hazards present in the work area. It is always best to consult with a qualified safety professional to develop a hot work permit that outlines all of the necessary precautions. Here are some specific examples of rectifications that may be necessary before starting hot work. If hot work is being performed on a tank that contains flammable liquids, the tank should be emptied and purged with inert gas. If hot work is being performed on electrical equipment, the equipment should be de-energized and locked out. If hot work is being performed in a confined space, the space should be purged with inert gas and monitored for oxygen levels. If hot work is being performed near combustible materials, the materials should be removed from the work area or covered with fire blankets. By taking the necessary rectifications before starting hot work, you can help to prevent fires and other accidents. To take safety precautions during hot work, you should follow these steps. Identify and evaluate the hazards. What are the potential fire and explosion hazards in the area where you will be performing hot work? What are the potential hazards to workers from sparks, heat, and fumes? Take steps to eliminate or control the hazards. This may involve moving flammable materials away from the work area, covering them with fire-resistant blankets, or using ventilation to remove fumes. Use appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE. This may include flame-resistant clothing, gloves, eye protection, and a hard hat. Have a fire watch in place. A fire watch is someone who is responsible for watching the hot work area for any signs of fire and taking action to extinguish it if necessary. Here are some specific safety precautions to take during hot work. Clear the work area of all flammable and combustible materials. This includes removing trash, paper, oil, grease, and other flammable substances. Cover any exposed electrical wiring or equipment with fire-resistant blankets. Use ventilation to remove fumes from the work area. This may involve using fans, exhaust hoods, or opening windows and doors. Wear appropriate PPE. This includes flame-resistant clothing, gloves, eye protection, and a hard hat. Have a fire watch in place. The fire watch should be located a safe distance away from the hot work area and should have access to fire extinguishers and other firefighting equipment. In addition to these general precautions, there are also specific safety precautions that should be taken for different types of hot work. For example, when welding, it is important to use a fire blanket to cover any nearby objects that could be ignited by sparks. When soldering, it is important to use a fume extractor to remove fumes from the work area. By following these safety precautions, you can help to prevent fires and explosions during hot work. Here are some additional tips for safety during hot work. Be aware of your surroundings and watch for potential hazards. Be careful not to bump into anything with your hot work equipment. Be careful not to trip or fall. Be aware of the wind direction and take steps to prevent sparks from blowing into flammable materials. Be sure to turn off all electrical equipment before starting hot work. Be sure to extinguish all hot work equipment before leaving the work area. If you have any concerns about safety during hot work, be sure to consult with a qualified safety professional. What is work at height? Work at height is any work where a person could potentially fall and injure themselves. This could be from a ladder, a roof's edge, because of breaking of fragile roof, through an opening on the floor. Even a loading dock can be working at height. The Indian Factories Act, 1948 regulates the safety of workers employed in factories, including those working at height. The Act defines working at height as working at any place where, if precautions are not taken, a person is liable to fall more than 2 meters. Section 14, 1c of the Factories Act, 1948 requires employers to take necessary measures to ensure the safety of workers who work at height. This includes providing appropriate safety equipment such as safety harnesses, safety belts, safety nets, and guardrails. Appointing a competent person to supervise work at height and ensure that safety measures are being followed. Providing workers with adequate rest periods to avoid fatigue and must not be required to work at height during adverse weather conditions. The Factories Act, 1948 does not specifically mention work at height in any other section. However, there are a number of other sections of the Act that are relevant to the safety of workers working at height, such as Section 11, 1, requires employers to provide safe means of access to and egress from every place at which any person is required to work. Section 12, 1, requires employers to provide and maintain safe means of securing, handling, transporting, and stacking of all loads. Section 13, 1, requires employers to ensure that all machinery and equipment is maintained in a safe condition. Employers must ensure that they comply with all of the relevant provisions of the Factories Act, 1948, including those relating to work at height. Failure to do so could result in serious injuries or even death to workers. In addition to the Factories Act, 1948, there are a number of other laws and regulations that apply to work at height in India. These include the Building and Other Construction Workers, Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service, Act, 1996. The Industrial Safety and Health Code, 2005. The Bureau of Indian Standards, BIS, Code for Safety Measures for Work at Height. Employers should ensure that they are familiar with all of the relevant laws and regulations that apply to work at height in India. How to take safety precautions during the work at height. Avoid work at height whenever possible. If there is a way to do the job safely from the ground, do it that way. Assess the risks before starting work. Consider the height of the task, the duration and frequency, and the condition of the surface being worked on. Use the right equipment. This may include guardrails, scaffolding, ladders, or personal fall arrest systems, PFAs. Inspect the equipment before use. Make sure it is in good condition and that all the necessary safety devices are in place. Use the equipment correctly. Follow the manufacturer's instructions carefully. Wear personal protective equipment, PPE. This may include a hard hat, safety harness, gloves, and eye protection. Specific safety precautions for different types of work at height. Ladders. Extend the ladder 3 feet past the level to which you are climbing. For every 4 feet that the ladder rises, place it 1 foot from the structure. Maintain 3 points of contact, example, 1 hand, 2 feet, at all times. Do not overload the ladder. Use a ladder stabilizer if needed. Scaffolding. Assemble the scaffolding properly and securely. Use all of the necessary safety devices, such as guardrails, toe boards, and diagonal braces. Do not overload the scaffolding. Be aware of your surroundings and avoid working near overhead hazards. Mobile Elevated Work Platforms, MEWPs. Wear a safety harness and be connected to the platform at all times. Extend the platform to the full height only when necessary. Be aware of your surroundings and avoid working near overhead hazards. Personal Fall Arrest Systems (PFAs). Wear the PFAs properly and be connected to a secure anchor point at all times. Test the PFAs before use to make sure it is in good working order. Additional safety tips. Be aware of the weather conditions. Avoid working at height in windy or wet conditions. Take breaks regularly. This will help you to stay focused and avoid fatigue. Communicate with others on the job site. Let someone know where you are and what you are doing. Have a plan for emergencies. Know how to evacuate from the work area safely if necessary. By following these safety precautions, you can help to prevent falls and injuries when working at height. How to confirm a height work? To confirm a height work, you should identify the hazards. What are the potential risks of falling from height? This includes factors such as the height of the work area, the type of surface, the presence of obstacles, and the weather conditions. Assess the risks. Once you have identified the hazards, you need to assess the level of risk associated with each one. This will help you to determine which control measures are necessary. Implement control measures. There are a number of control measures that can be used to mitigate the risk of falls from height. These include eliminating the need to work at height. This may be possible by redesigning the work area or using other methods to access the work area. Putting in place physical barriers. This could include guardrails, fences, or netting. Using fall protection equipment. This could include harnesses, lifelines, and safety nets. Monitor the work. Once the control measures have been implemented, you need to monitor the work to ensure that they are effective. This may involve inspecting the work area regularly and checking that the workers are using the fall protection equipment correctly. In addition to the above, you should also confirm a height work by ensuring that all workers are properly trained in working at height. This training should cover the hazards associated with working at height, the control measures that can be used to mitigate these hazards, and the correct use of fall protection equipment. Requiring workers to wear appropriate personal protective equipment (PPE). This could include harnesses, hard hats, safety glasses, and gloves. Checking that all equipment is in good condition and properly maintained. This includes fall protection equipment, ladders, scaffolding, and other work at height equipment. Having a clear and documented safety plan in place. This plan should outline the hazards associated with the work, the control measures that will be implemented, and the procedures that will be followed in the event of an accident. By following these steps, you can help to ensure that all height work is carried out safely. Here are some specific questions that you can ask to confirm a height work. What is the height of the work area? What type of surface is the work area made of? Are there any obstacles in the work area? What are the weather conditions like? Are all workers properly trained in working at height? Are all workers wearing appropriate PPE? Is all equipment in good condition and properly maintained? Is there a clear and documented safety plan in place? If you are unsure about any aspect of a height work, it is always best to err on the side of caution and postpone the work until you have addressed all of your concerns. What is confined space? A confined space has limited or restricted means of entry or exit. Is large enough for a person to enter to perform tasks. Is not designed or configured for continuous occupancy. Confined spaces can be found in almost any workplace, including tanks, vessels, silos, storage bins, hoppers, walls pits, manholes, tunnels, equipment housings, ductwork, pipelines, Confined spaces can pose a number of hazards to workers, including hazardous atmospheres, such as flammable or explosive gases, oxygen-deficient air, or toxic fumes, entrapment by free-flowing solids or liquids, electrocution, heat stress, noise exposure, falls. Because of the hazards associated with confined spaces, it is important to take steps to protect workers who must enter them. This may include assessing the hazards in the confined space before entry, developing a confined space entry plan, using appropriate personal protective equipment (PPE), having a rescue plan in place. In some cases, confined spaces may be considered permit-required confined spaces, permit spaces. This means that workers must obtain a permit before entering and must be accompanied by a qualified attendant. If you are required to enter a confined space, it is important to be aware of the hazards and to take steps to protect yourself. Hazards in confined spaces. Confined spaces are areas that are large enough for a person to enter and perform work, but have limited openings for entry and exit, and are not designed for continuous occupancy. Confined spaces can pose a number of hazards to workers, including hazardous atmospheres. Confined spaces can contain hazardous atmospheres, such as toxic gases, flammable fumes, or oxygen-deficient air. These hazards can cause serious illness or death if workers are exposed to them. Engulfment hazards. Confined spaces can contain liquids or solids that can engulf workers, leading to drowning, suffocation, or other injuries. Fall hazards. Confined spaces often have uneven surfaces and limited lighting, which can increase the risk of falls. Electrical hazards. Confined spaces may contain exposed electrical wiring or other electrical hazards. Mechanical hazards. Confined spaces may contain moving machinery or other mechanical hazards. Heat stress. Confined spaces can be hot and humid, which can lead to heat stress and other health problems. Safety precautions for confined spaces. To ensure the safety of workers entering confined spaces, the following precautions should be taken. Conduct a hazard assessment before any work is conducted in a confined space. A thorough hazard assessment should be conducted to identify and assess all of the potential hazards. Obtain a confined space entry permit. Once the hazard assessment has been completed, a confined space entry permit should be obtained. This permit should outline the specific work to be conducted, the hazards that have been identified, and the safety precautions that will be taken. Provide adequate ventilation. If the confined space contains a hazardous atmosphere, it is important to ventilate the space before workers enter. This can be done using fans or other ventilation equipment. Use personal protective equipment. PPE. Workers entering confined spaces should wear appropriate PPE, such as respiratory protection, fall protection, and safety harnesses. Have a rescue plan in place. A rescue plan should be in place in case of an emergency in the confined space. This plan should identify who is responsible for rescue and what equipment will be used. Additional safety precautions. In addition to the above precautions, the following safety measures can also be taken to reduce the risks associated with working in confined spaces. Train workers on confined space safety. Workers who will be entering confined spaces should be trained on the hazards associated with confined spaces and the safety precautions that must be taken. Supervise workers entering confined spaces. Workers entering confined spaces should be supervised by a competent person who is familiar with the confined space entry permit and the safety precautions that have been taken. Communicate with workers entering confined spaces. Workers entering confined spaces should be able to communicate with workers outside the space in case of an emergency. This can be done using radios or other communication devices. By following these safety precautions, employers can help to protect workers from the hazards associated with working in confined spaces. Safety precautions during confined space work. Conduct a thorough risk assessment. This will identify the hazards present in the confined space and the precautions that need to be taken. Obtain a confined space entry permit. This permit should detail the hazards present, the precautions that have been taken, and the procedures to be followed in the event of an emergency. Ensure that the confined space is properly ventilated. This can be done by natural means or using mechanical ventilation. Test the atmosphere of the confined space before entry. This should be done using a calibrated gas detector to check for the presence of toxic, flammable, or oxygen-deficient gases. Provide workers with appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE. This may include respiratory protection, hearing protection, and protective clothing. Have a confined space attendant present. The attendant should be outside the confined space and should be able to communicate with the workers inside. The attendant should also be able to summon help in the event of an emergency. Establish a communication plan. This should detail how workers inside the confined space can communicate with each other and with the attendant. Have a rescue plan in place. This plan should detail how workers can be rescued from the confined space in the event of an emergency. Additional safety precautions. Ensure that all workers are properly trained on confined space entry procedures. Use only equipment that is suitable for use in confined spaces. Be aware of the potential for confined space fires and explosions. Be aware of the potential for confined space hazards such as heat stress, noise exposure, and falls. By following these safety precautions, you can help to reduce the risk of accidents and injuries during confined space work. The amount of oxygen required in a confined space depends on the type of work being done and the number of people present. For example, if the work involves strenuous activity, such as welding, a higher level of oxygen may be required. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, recommends that the oxygen level in a confined space be maintained at 19.5% to 23.5%. There are a number of hazards that can exist in a confined space, including lack of oxygen. This can lead to hypoxia, which can cause dizziness, confusion, and loss of consciousness. Toxic gases. These gases can be harmful to breathe and can cause a variety of health problems, including respiratory problems, poisoning, and death. Flammable gases. These gases can explode if they come into contact with an ignition source. Entrapment. This can occur if someone falls into a hole or becomes wedged in a tight space. To eliminate hazards in a confined space, it is important to take the following steps. Identify the hazards. This can be done by conducting a hazard assessment. Implement controls to eliminate or mitigate the hazards. This may involve using ventilation to remove toxic gases, using explosion-proof equipment, and providing proper training to workers. Provide workers with personal protective equipment, PPE. This may include respirators, gloves, and safety glasses. Have a rescue plan in place. This plan should include procedures for rescuing workers who become trapped or injured. It is important to note that working in a confined space can be dangerous, and it is important to take all necessary precautions to protect workers. What is work at height? Work at height is any work where a person could potentially fall and injure themselves. This could be from a ladder, a roof's edge, because of breaking of fragile roof, through an opening on the floor. Even a loading dock can be working at height. The Indian Factories Act, 1948 regulates the safety of workers employed in factories, including those working at height. The Act defines working at height as working at any place where, if precautions are not taken, a person is liable to fall more than 2 meters. Section 14(1)(c) of the Factories Act, 1948 requires employers to take necessary measures to ensure the safety of workers who work at height. This includes providing appropriate safety equipment such as safety harnesses, safety belts, safety nets, and guardrails. Appointing a competent person to supervise work at height and ensure that safety measures are being followed. Providing workers with adequate rest periods to avoid fatigue and must not be required to work at height during adverse weather conditions. The Factories Act, 1948 does not specifically mention work at height in any other section. However, there are a number of other sections of the Act that are relevant to the safety of workers working at height, such as Section 11(1) requires employers to provide safe means of access to and egress from every place at which any person is required to work. Section 12(1) requires employers to provide and maintain safe means of securing, handling, transporting, and stacking of all loads. Section 13(1) requires employers to ensure that all machinery and equipment is maintained in a safe condition. Employers must ensure that they comply with all of the relevant provisions of the Factories Act, 1948, including those relating to work at height. Failure to do so could result in serious injuries or even death to workers. In addition to the Factories Act, 1948, there are a number of other laws and regulations that apply to work at height in India. These include the Building and Other Construction Workers, Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service, Act, 1996. The Industrial Safety and Health Code, 2005. The Bureau of Indian Standards, BIS, Code for Safety Measures for Work at Height.